so glad that you could all be here to welcome back one of Darien Library's most beloved authors, a man who first visited our community in November 2007 to speak about his best-selling book, Ike, an American Hero. He then celebrated with us by participating in our grand opening author series in February 2009 with his critically acclaimed Battle of Britain account, With Wings Like Eagles. And now, to our sheer delight, he has joined us a third time, once again to discuss his newest book, Hero, which chronicles one of history's most influential, most storied, and perhaps most mysterious of icons of modern times, Englishman T.E. Lawrence. Known throughout the world as the romantic, fearless warrior Lawrence of Arabia, this historical icon's role in and vision for the Middle East, his personal and public relationships, and his struggles with loyalty and fame make him all the more intriguing, complex, and heroic. And this character, combined with never-before-revealed research and masterful storytelling by our author here, makes for an incredible and incredibly compelling biography, one that Henry Kissinger praises as, quote, a work of brilliance, discernment, and meticulous scholarship that surely will be hailed as the gold standard. Our guest speaker for tonight is currently the editor-in-chief emeritus of Simon & Schuster. In addition to the previously mentioned titles, he is also the best-selling author of Country Matters, Ulysses S. Grant, Journey to a Revolution, and Charmed Lives. We are beyond thrilled that he's here to charm us for a third time. Won't you please join me in welcoming back to Darien Library, Mr. Michael Korda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here, and to be here for the third time is an enormous honor. Oh, if only he had died in battle. I have lost my son, but I do not grieve for him as I do for Lawrence. I am counted brave, the bravest of my tribe. My heart was iron, but his was steel. A man whose hand was never closed, but open. Tell them in England what I say. Of manhood, the man. In freedom, free. A mind without equal. I can see no flaw in him. These are the words of T. Lawrence's friend, Sheikh Hamoudi, on learning of Lawrence's death in a motorcycle accident in 1935. Another friend, John Buchan, author of the famous spy novels Greenmantle, which is thought to be based on the adventures of Lawrence, and the 39 Steps, wrote, I do not pretend to have understood T.E. Lawrence fully, still less to be able to portray him. There is no brush fine enough to catch the subtleties of his mind, no aerial viewpoint high enough to bring into one picture the manifold of his character. I am not a tractable person or much of a hero worshipper, but I could have followed Lawrence over the edge of the world. If genius be, in Emerson's phrase, a stellar and undiminishable something whose origin is a mystery and whose essence cannot be defined, then he was the only man of genius I have ever known. These are unusual tributes to a most unusual man, for Lawrence was a protean figure, not only in legend but in fact. Born the illegitimate son of a wealthy English aristocrat, Sir Thomas Chapman, who abandoned family, name, title, land, and fortune to run away with the young Scottish governess of his 4 daughters, Lawrence was and remains still one of the most controversial figures in British history and letters. Though his father and mother never married, Lady Chapman refused to give her husband a divorce, they had 5 sons, of which T. Lawrence was the second. A brilliant scholar, whose first at Oxford was so remarkable that his tutor gave a black-tie dinner party for the examiners to celebrate Lawrence's achievement. He was a gifted young archaeologist whose 4 years in Syria helped to uncover the lost city and the culture of the Hittites, and upon whose adventures the character of Indiana Jones was largely based. A daring young explorer whose search in 1914 for the route by which Moses led the Jews across the Sinai was at least partly a cover for mapping the area across which the Turks would surely attack the Suez Canal if or when war broke out between the great powers. A gifted intelligence analyst whose reports, even when he was merely a temporary second lieutenant in Cairo in 1915 and 1916, were eagerly read at the very highest political and military levels in London. Lawrence went on to become, at the age of 28, a self-taught military genius, the inventor of a new form of guerrilla warfare who would influence Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, and the modern Islamic insurgents. A legendary warrior and hero, and in his role as a diplomat and statesman, a creator of two nations, which both survive, as well as the author of one of the most famous books ever written about war in the English language, 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And of course, the world's first and most long-lived media celebrity, born with what Henry James called the génie de réclame, a natural gift for publicity which would be the envy of any movie star, for Lawrence's name is still as famous today as it was 75 years ago upon his death. The First World War has long since receded from the memory of most people. The very last of those who fought in it are dead now. The wounds of that great conflict have been not so much healed as scarred over by other and more recent catastrophes. Out of the many millions who fought in that war, how many of its countless heroes are still recognizable by name to the average person, indeed to anyone in the English-speaking world? Only one. For even those who know nothing at all about what was called until 1939 the Great War are still likely to recognize the name of at least one of its heroes, Lawrence of Arabia. Of course, to many people, Lawrence of Arabia is Peter O'Toole. It is surely no accident that Lawrence was the hero of one of the most successful films ever made, David Lean's 1962 masterpiece, Lawrence of Arabia. But we must bear in mind that it is a drama, not a docudrama. Even the most successful film does not convey the full complexity of a real person. It's not just that O'Toole is 6'2" and Lawrence was 5'5". The real Lawrence was also bewilderingly complex. A man of extraordinary talents, even genius, with a gift for friendship far beyond the ordinary, and far from stumbling accidentally into the great adventure that turned him into Lawrence of Arabia, he set out even as a schoolboy with the ambition of becoming a general and being knighted before he was 30. Ambitions that were well within his grasp by the age of 30, had he still wanted them. It would not have surprised him that the Library of Congress has over 100 books on the subject of T.E. Lawrence, no less than 56 of them biographies. There are also 4 children's books about him, 2 plays, one by George Bernard Shaw, one by Terence Rattigan, not only 1 but 2 films, a scholarly journal, and innumerable websites. For a man who died at the age of 46 and whose military achievements, however extraordinary, were squeezed into 2 years, that's a lot of words. Lawrence's fame exceeded that of any other mortal during his own lifetime, in part because of Lowell Thomas's 1921 film, lecture, and travelogue, With Lawrence in Arabia, which was seen by many millions of people in the United States, the United Kingdom, and the British Commonwealth. It was the world's first full-length documentary film. the first film in which sound was ever keyed to action, the first film ever to fill Madison Square Garden in New York City, the first film ever played at the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden. It was, at the dawn of the age of the cinema, the first multimedia international show business sensation in which music, film, and still photographs were woven together with a master hand around a single, real, heroic figure, or, as Lowell Thomas called him in his lectures, the uncrowned king of Arabia, the prince of Mecca, and, in the United States, the George Washington of Arabia. Lawrence's face was as famous and as recognizable in his day as Princess Diana's was in hers. And like her, he struggled on the one hand to escape from his fame, and on the other hand, courted it. Like her, he lived in the limelight. Like her, his every move was news. Like her, he was surrounded by photographers, the equivalent of what are now called paparazzi. Like her, he sat for more photographs, paintings, and sculptures than anyone else in his generation. Like her, he met a tragic early death in a road accident. And like her, his demise was front-page news all over the world, with photographers trying desperately to get into the mortuary to take the final picture of his corpse. But who was Lawrence, and what did he do? We live in an age when the word hero has perhaps come to be overused. We have become used to thinking of heroism as something that simply happens to people. Indeed, the word has been cheapened by the modern habit of calling everybody exposed to any kind of danger, whether voluntarily or not, quote, a hero, unquote. Soldiers, indeed anybody in uniform, are now commonly referred to as our heroes, as if it were a universal quality shared by everyone who bears arms. Lawrence, however, was a hero in the much older classical sense of the word. It was no accident that his last written work was a much admired translation of Homer's Odyssey, which is still in print. And like the heroes of old, he trained himself from early childhood for that role. Without the war, he might never have accomplished his ambition, but once war came, he was prepared for it both morally and physically. He had schooled himself to an almost inhuman capacity to endure pain and to do without food and water. As a youth, he had walked barefoot in the desert. Like the young Napoleon, he was ready to assume the role of hero when fate presented him with the opportunity. He seized it eagerly with both hands at Aqaba in 1917, and like Ajax, Achilles, and Ulysses, he could never let go of it. For no matter how hard Lawrence tried to escape from his own legend and fame, they stuck to him to the very end and beyond. He remains as famous today as ever. His name will live in history, King George V wrote on Lawrence's death in 1935. And so it has. I have chosen to begin my biography of Lawrence with the act that made him famous overnight, the Taking of Aqaba. By 1916, the First World War had become a deadly trap for all the nations involved. On the Western Front, the war had long since ground down to a bloody stalemate in the trenches, taking lives by the millions for little or no gain in ground. Attempts to break through were costly catastrophes. The German attack at Verdun in 1916 cost them over 300,000 men and inflicted over 400,000 casualties on the French. The British attack at the First Battle of the Somme, begun to relieve the pressure on the French army, would cost them nearly 600,000 casualties, 60,000 on the first day, the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. There were those who believed that there must be a better way of winning the war than that of battering one's head against a brick wall at the cost of millions of lives, and that perhaps attacking Germany's weakest ally, Turkey, might pay better dividends, and Lawrence was one of them. However, a British attack on the Ottoman Empire, intended to open a year-round warm water route to supply Russia through the Straits of the Dardanelles, ended in the disaster of Gallipoli, which cost the British, the Australians, and the New Zealanders over 49,000 dead and over 200,000 wounded. One of those who died was the admired British poet Rupert Brooke. Another British army, advancing from Basra to take Baghdad, was surrounded and besieged halfway there by the Turks at Kut el Imara. The British War Cabinet sent a young intelligence officer, a temporary second lieutenant and acting staff captain named T. Lawrence, from Cairo to offer the Turkish commander £1 million in gold to let the besieged British army in Kut go. An offer which the Turkish general courteously refused over dinner. Lawrence, a diffidently dressed young Oxford scholar, an archaeologist in uniform, and mighty sloppy uniform at that, was never surprised at being in the thick of things. While there were those who were skeptical of him, one of his seniors in Cairo inquired shortly after Lawrence arrived there, "Who is this extraordinary pipsqueak?" Most people fell under his spell. He was brilliant, hard-working. He had made himself the foremost expert on the Turkish army. Full generals paid attention to what he had to say. Thus it was hardly surprising that in October 1916, Lawrence was sent to Jeddah, the seaport of Mecca on the Red Sea, to appraise which of the sons of Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif and Emir of Mecca, seemed the best for the British to support. Though the Arab revolt had broken out in June 1916, it had so far made little headway against the Turks. True, the Turks had been driven out of Mecca, but an Arab attack on Medina, some 200 miles to the north, had been repulsed with heavy losses. The Bedouin tribes were brave, but they were not trained to fight a conventional war against a modern army. There, in the stifling heat of Arabia, Lawrence described it inimitably in 7 Pillars of Wisdom. The heat of Arabia came out like a drawn sword, he wrote, and smote us speechless. Lawrence met with Abdullah, the second of Sharif Hussein's 5 sons, and so dazzled Abdullah by his knowledge of the Turkish army, who commanded what division and how reliable its troops were, that Abdullah cried out in amazement, "Is this man God to know everything?" In fact, Abdullah was so dazzled that he agreed to call his father. Surprisingly, there was a telephone system in Mecca in which Sharif Hussein's number was, very appropriately, Mecca 1, and obtained permission for Lawrence to ride inland. To understand how extraordinary this was, you must keep in mind that Mecca and the desert around it was and remains holy land, forbidden to foreigners and infidels. But since nobody in Jeddah seemed to know what the Arab army was doing, or even where it was, Lawrence decided to go and find it. He rode off into the desert by night, accompanied by an Arab guide and his son. He traveled in Arab robes and headdress, since there was a very good chance he would be murdered as a foreigner in uniform so near Mecca and Medina, 2 of the 3 holiest cities of the Muslim world. The third, of course, is Jerusalem. After 2 days and nights of hard riding in blistering heat, Lawrence was not yet accustomed to riding a camel. He at last reached Wadi Safra, where Emir Faisal, the third of Hussein's sons, was camped with his defeated army, and there Lawrence met the leader he had been searching for. "I felt at a glance that now I had found the man whom I had come to Arabia to seek," Lawrence wrote. He looked very tall and pillar-like. very slender, dressed in long silk robes and a headcloth bound with a brilliant scarlet and gold cord. His eyelids were drooped, and his close black beard and colorless face were like a mask against the strange, still watchfulness of his body. His hands were crossed loosely in front of him on his dagger. Lawrence almost immediately saw that taking Medina was neither possible nor necessary, that in his words, the Turks' position at Medina was all flanks and no front, that cutting the railway that ran from Damascus to Medina across almost 800 miles of desert would effectively keep several divisions of Turkish infantry busy defending their supply line, and that what the Arab army needed was a good port north of Medina to which the British could send small arms, gold, and supplies. The port of Aqaba was well defended against attack from the sea, but the Turks did not believe it could be attacked from inland across some of the harshest and most difficult desert terrain in the world. With the help of the formidable Hawatite warrior chief Auda Abu Tai, who had killed at least 70 people with his own hands in desert feuds, Auda did not bother to count Turks. Lawrence plunged off on a reconnaissance mission across the desert that took him all the way to Damascus itself, despite a price on his head, then brought the pick of the desert tribes down through the mountains to take Aqaba from the rear where it was undefended. Aqaba made Lawrence an instant hero. He was recommended for the Victoria Cross, but since there were no British witnesses to his feats, he was instead made a companion of the Order of the Bath, an extraordinary honor for a 29-year-old junior officer, one which he shared with Nelson and the Duke of Wellington. Lawrence did not decline it. He could not. But he ignored it, as he would every other honor he was awarded. For he already knew about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which the British and the French had agreed to carve up the Middle East between themselves, and knew that what the Arabs were fighting for, a single, unified nation stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, they would not get. The 2 years in which Lawrence fought with such extraordinary bravery and skill were therefore agonizing to him. He felt that he was leading the Arabs on with false promises, and hoped that by capturing Damascus before the British and the French could get there, they might establish an Arab government and win their independence in the eyes of the world. It was this sense of guilt, intensified by Lawrence's personal experience when he was taken, though unrecognized, by the Turks at Darien as he walked in to study the town's defenses, and subjected to terrible beatings and to a gruesome gang rape, that made Lawrence the most poignant and unwilling of great heroes, one who despised himself for having failed the Arabs and for having surrendered himself to violent sexual abuse. Nevertheless, Lawrence created a new kind of warfare, one in which he deliberately avoided conventional battles and instead inflicted on the enemy an endless series of what he called pinpricks, in which the Arabs would ride out of the desert, blow up a train or a bridge, inflict casualties, then disappear back into the desert where the Turks could not follow them, to regroup and attack again somewhere else. By these tactics, a handful of men, armed only with explosives and light weapons, could paralyze an army. What he did should sound familiar to us today. In describing the war in Afghanistan, for instance, the New York Times had this to say about our Taliban opponents. Quote, "They are a resilient, canny insurgency that has bled American forces through in a war of small cuts. The insurgents set the war's pace, usually fighting on ground of their own choosing and then slipping away. Sabotage and trickery have been weapons every bit as potent as small arms, mortars, or suicide bombers." Every word of this might have been written by or about Lawrence. It is how he taught the Arab army to fight, and he used it to bring down a vastly bigger and better equipped army and to undermine a large and powerful empire. He himself described attempts to put down such a guerrilla force as, quote, like eating soup with a knife, messy and slow. And the tactics of our enemies today, by no accident, are exactly those which Lawrence devised 94 years ago. Lawrence brought the Arabs victory, but he could not bring them what they had fought for, a single unitary Arab state stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf with Damascus as his capital. Raised to the heights of fame by his achievements, but at the same time crippled by his sense of failure, Lawrence went on to try and secure the Arabs' independence at the War Cabinet in London and at the Paris Peace Conference after the war. He became their spokesman in Britain, lobbying at the very highest levels, including the King and Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Eventually, turning himself into a diplomat, he joined the Colonial Office at the personal request of Winston Churchill and played a major role in the creation of Jordan and Iraq. Indeed, the current frontiers of the Middle East were in part Lawrence's creation. He foresaw many of the problems that haunt us still in the Middle East and tried to prevent them, almost succeeding in getting the British to agree to a joint Arab and Zionist state in Palestine and to an independent Kurdish state. But in the end, the greed of the French for territory and of the British for oil was too much for Lawrence to overcome. And exhausted by the effort of writing his 400,000-word account of the Arab revolt, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and at exactly the moment when Lowell Thomas was making him famous with his film and lecture, Lawrence tried to step out of the limelight by enlisting under a false name in the ranks of the infant Royal Air Force. Naturally, he did not succeed. His life became a succession of failed attempts to vanish from the headlines, interrupted by tremendous bursts of publicity. Each book he wrote, 7 Pillars, The Mint, his translation of the Odyssey, made him more famous despite himself. It did him no good to turn down his decorations, to change his name, to decline the offer of a knighthood from the king, or to have himself posted as an airman to the borders of faraway Afghanistan to escape the attention of the press. His fame followed him everywhere, and in the end, he only eluded it by his death in a motorcycle accident in 1935, which was, of course, ironically, headline news throughout the world. Lawrence was 46 when he died. In his short lifetime, he had done more than any other man to shape the future of the Middle East. He had accomplished feats of heroism seldom equaled by anyone. He had borne the burden of self-imposed guilt, written one of the great classics of English literature, and come closer than anyone has since the creation, has come closer than anyone has since to the creation of a Palestine in which both the Jews and the Arabs might live at peace. 2 Arab royal families, those of Iraq and of Jordan, owed to him their lands and their thrones. But his wartime exploits only represent 2 years out of his life. His books mattered more to him than his wartime adventures. Those and his friends, which included Winston Churchill, Bernard Shaw, Thomas Hardy, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, E.M. Forster, Nancy Astor, and Noel Coward. Throughout his short lifetime, he had an extraordinary effect on people and events. He was not merely a hero. He became the symbol for innumerable other heroes whose names were not remembered. Those who fought or who died in World War I. He was a painful but glamorous reminder of not only the sacrifices that had been made in that war, but of the failures that had taken place after it, at the peace conference and elsewhere. The broken promises, the hasty and misjudged frontiers, the greed for oil that had led to the dismemberment of the Middle East and much else besides. Lawrence reminded people constantly, by his work, by his fame, by his highly visible public atonement, by his very presence, of what might have been achieved after the Allied victory and was not. Nobody understood this better than Lawrence himself, who wrote in a passage that might serve as the defining anthem of the lost generation and of the work of writers like Ernest Hemingway in America, Henri Barbusse in France, Robert Graves in England. Quote, "We lived many lives in those whirling campaigns, never sparing ourselves any good or evil. Yet when we achieved and the new world dawned, the old men came out again and took from us our victory and remade it in the likeness of the former world they knew." These words are constantly quoted about the 20s and the 30s, even by people who do not know that they are from 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Lawrence was, without having sought to become it, a glowing and sacrificial figure, the symbol for the heroism and the sacrifice of the 1914-1918 war, and for the failure of the combatant countries to live up to the ideals for which that war had been fought, and for the peace treaty which plunged us into a new world war only 20 years after the old one had ended. He carried that burden, the downside of his glittering celebrity, until his death. Hence his continuing fame 3/4 of a century after he died. Nobody described Lawrence better than himself. He wrote, "All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dream with open eyes to make it possible. This I did." Before we get to questions, I'm just going to run through, for those of you who have the curiosity, that is Lawrence as he was in 1919, painted by Augustus John, probably the most emblematic of his portraits, and the one that he himself liked best. That, of course, is Peter O'Toole and Lawrence. It doesn't show their difference in height. That is, which I love, one of the many posters for Lowell Thomas's With Lawrence of Arabia, showing how bizarrely Lawrence was being portrayed already in 1920. In 1920, when Lowell Thomas gave this 2.5-hour mixed media show, which included a brass band, an orchestra, dancing girls, and every other imaginable thing, in Madison Square Garden, filled twice a day for months on end. Lawrence's portrait, his photographs, blown up to enormous size, were in the windows of every department store on Fifth Avenue. Lawrence, who at the time was in the Middle East trying to broker a new division of the Middle East and achieve his various ambitions, had no idea that Lowell Thomas was in New York making him world famous. That is Lawrence in Damascus in 1918, already a sadder Lawrence, knowing that the Arabs are not going to get what he wanted for them or what they fought for. The dagger, the gold dagger, he went to Mecca to buy, which is, of course, against every possible rule of Muslim life. No infidel or foreigner was ever allowed into Mecca, and now sits in All Souls College in Oxford, along with much of Lawrence's other desert paraphernalia. Emir Faisal, who eventually was to become the first king of Iraq, largely thanks to Lawrence, and whose brother Abdullah became, of course, the first king of Jordan, largely thanks to Lawrence. This is a picture actually taken by Lawrence, who may be the only major war hero who carried a folding pocket Kodak in his kit, and who photographed things along the way, and had a wonderful eye for photography, learned from his father. And this is the advance on Aqaba in 1917, photographed by Lawrence. The Emir Faisal, for some reason we're going backwards, that's my fault. Lowell Thomas was probably better at this. This is actually film, if you can see it, which I can't from here, taken by Lowell Thomas in Arabia in 1917. Amazing stuff. You can see that Lawrence's armored cars, he came to prefer armored cars to camels, are blowing up a Turkish bridge and train, photographed in 1917, an amazing document. This is another Lowell Thomas snippet of film from his lecture showing the advancing Arab armies. This is Lawrence in the second row, standing behind Faisal at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, dressed in British uniform with an Arab headdress, and behind him the Sudanese slave, servant, and bodyguard of Emir Faisal. This is the entire Arab delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. And the picture of Faisal is hauntingly exactly like the words which Lawrence used to describe him and which I spoke to you. This is amazing. It is Lawrence's own map prepared for the British War Cabinet in November of 1918 and for the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, showing what Lawrence wanted the Middle East to become. I'm not going to go over it with you in great detail, but it shows that he already understood that the Kurds would need a separate nation, something which is still being fought out today. He already planned for a Palestine that would include Arabs and Jews with equal share in the government. And that in general, he had a much more sensible and much more humanistic approach to the settlement of the Middle East than ever has been had since. It is an amazing document. Amazing, too, that it still exists. And this is a typical page from a London newspaper on the day after Lawrence's death on his motorcycle. And shows the extraordinary extent of his fame. Every single London newspaper, every single American newspaper devoted the entire front page to the death of the former second lieutenant and staff captain who had become Lawrence of Arabia. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Michael, before we take questions, if I can make two quick announcements. We have a patron who's been waiting patiently and is currently boxed in. If you're driving a silver Lexus RX 330, I ask that you please move it so that she can go home and get a good night's sleep for school tomorrow. And second, if you have a question, we're going to ask. We have a very large crowd here of people standing all the way in the back. If you can just project loudly, that would be wonderful so that everybody can hear your question. Thank you.
If I don't hear you, she will repeat your question more loudly in my ears.
Without Lowell Thomas, how famous would Lawrence have been?
It's an interesting question. I think Lawrence would have been, and already was, enormously famous. He was famous when Lowell Thomas first met him in 1917. Lowell Thomas met him when Thomas managed to turn up in Jerusalem as the only person to take a picture of the British and French as they captured Jerusalem. And there he met Lawrence and was enormously impressed. Lawrence had already become by that time something of a legend. Lawrence's subsequent rise to celebrity, which is putting it very mildly, I tend to think might not have happened to the degree that it did at all without Lowell Thomas. It's almost impossible for us to imagine what Lowell Thomas's travelogues and lectures were like, and how many millions of people in the United States, the British Empire and Commonwealth saw it, and how impressed people were. All the foreign leaders saw it in London. King George V saw it twice. Queen Mary saw it 3 times. Winston Churchill saw it. David Lloyd George saw it. Hardly anybody who mattered, but also millions of people who perhaps didn't matter saw it as it was toured. Interestingly enough, it was so big an event, so huge an event, that Lowell Thomas could not always be present to be the lecturer. And so he had 2 different companies touring it, one in which he lectured, the other in which he chose a young, ambitious, and very fluent young man whose name was Dale Carnegie, the future author of How to Win Friends and Influence People, the book which, by the way, sealed the fact that Simon & Schuster would succeed as a business early on in its existence. Dale Carnegie had a second company which he toured and played the Lowell Thomas part in. So yes, I tend to think that that Lowell Thomas was, through no fault of Lawrence's, a determining factor in making Lawrence into the kind of celebrity that he became. Lowell Thomas and Lawrence actually got along quite well, and Mrs. Lawrence, whose letters are all at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, along with the rest of Lowell Thomas's belongings and films and pictures, remarks that she herself saw Lawrence at least 5 times watching the Lowell Thomas show. But that too is very typical of Lawrence. Lawrence had, his friend Bernard Shaw said he has a talent for backing into the limelight. And it's true, Lawrence had that. He had, as I think Princess Diana did, a fatal combination of desire for privacy and excitement at his own incredible fame. That is a very potent and very dangerous mixture. It did neither of them any good. I'm going to start sort of going in this direction. Ma'am?
He never married or had children?
No. There's a whole other story contained in my book. Well, there are no children present, so. Because Lawrence's father had abandoned his 4 daughters and run away with their young governess to change his name and have 5 sons. She actually bore 8 children, of whom 5 sons survived. Lawrence, for that and a number of other reasons, from very earliest childhood, set out to repress in himself every sexual instinct. Not an easy thing to do, as those of you will be aware who've tried it. For Lawrence, it was a huge, disciplined effort. It resulted, I think, in some of the things that made Lawrence spectacularly different and spectacularly successful, is that his sexual energy was in fact transformed into other things, into warfare, into being a hero, into his archaeological studies, into his books, which are all of them like grueling marathon experiences. He wrote as many as 16,000 words of Seven Pillars of Wisdom in one night. At the same time, it's not an easy thing to do. I think that the determining moment in Lawrence's life was when he was captured by the Turks, though not recognized as Lawrence. There was already, I believe, a 20,000 pound price on his head to be paid in gold, but they thought he was a Circassian, who are essentially white, Caucasian people, blonde, blue-eyed, who were driven out of the Russian Empire and took refuge in Turkey, where they were appreciated but not trusted. And he was beaten, savagely beaten, and he was sexually abused. He describes it in great and rather horrible detail in Seven Pillars of Wisdom. He was essentially anally gang raped by the Turks in Darien, and then kicked out into the street, bloodied from head to foot. The terror of that for Lawrence was not that he might be killed, or that if he were recognized, he would surely have been killed. It was that in the course of this beating and sexual rape, he felt a sexual arousal. And that sexual arousal, of course, only provoked the Turks to beat him worse, because they made fun of it and joked at it and beat him all the harder, since they had recognized, of course, what it was that gave him pleasure. It would be an oversimplification to say that pain gave Lawrence pleasure. To a degree, of course, that's true, and it's true of a lot of people. I think it's probably, however, more to the point that Lawrence was horrified under these frightening and frightful circumstances to discover in himself a sexual arousal which he could not control, and which was stronger than he was. And in subsequent years, he, in moments of great stress, employed a fellow soldier during the time he was in the army under a false name as a private, to whip him. Not what you would call recreational beating, but savage, serious beating that brought large quantities of blood and wounds which were visible on his body when he died, and were indeed visible on his body whenever he had a medical examination as an airman in the Royal Air Force or a soldier in the Army under his different names. So it is improbable that Lawrence would ever have had children. He had many women friends. He was not one who shied from the company of women, and was very close to many of them. But the notion of a sexual contact with a woman was truly horrifying to him because of the relationship between his father and mother. And the notion of a sexual contact with anyone was repellent to him because it represented both a giving in to impulses which he had never accepted, and a reminder that he was not entirely able to completely control those impulses. So, no children for Lawrence. Sorry, ma'am.
I think many of us grew up watching the movie Lawrence of Arabia. But would you comment on any discrepancies that you found in your research between the movie and your research?
I'd be happy to. Let me first of all say that I knew David Lean quite well. I mean, I was a teenager and David Lean was a grown-up, but but I was present during all the time when David Lean made Sound Barrier with my father as art director, and also Summertime with Katharine Hepburn, in which my father was art director. And I am a huge admirer of David Lean's, and I think Lawrence of Arabia is ultimately the best epic film ever made, without a question, and the most beautiful and the most exciting to watch. Having said that, it is a movie. The script neglects all sorts of things. First of all, it gives the impression that Lawrence was nobody when he arrived in Cairo in 1916 as a second lieutenant, and that he stumbled into the desert by accident. That is not true. Secondly, it only represents 2 years of Lawrence's life, 1917 and 1918, and therefore leaves out the whole complicated, what Freud called family romance of Lawrence's birth, growing up, his brothers, and the entirely amazing late Victorian scandal of his parents coming together. It also ends with Lawrence leaving Damascus, which for Lawrence was the beginning of a whole new life, and the beginning of a fame he could not control, and of a literary career which was quite amazing. So I take it in stride. It's a film which conveys not an altogether untrue picture of Lawrence in the 2 years in which he was in the desert. It is wonderful about Auda Abu Tai, and every actor in the film is absolutely terrific. Many of the things that Lawrence devotees, loyalists, complain about are really true. It is certainly true, for those of you who remember the film, that after he had seen the Turkish destruction, rape, and murder of an Arab village as he approached Damascus in 1918, that Lawrence said effectively, "No prisoners. He who loves me best will bring me the most dead Turks." And started a massacre which then escaped beyond his control. So, yes, it represents both the dark and the light sides of Lawrence, but it is only one slice of Lawrence's life.
This might be a bit of an unfair question, but if Lawrence had been more successful in his advocacy of the Arabic cause during the Treaty of Versailles, what do you think the impact of that would have been on the shenanigans that are going on now in the Middle East?
Well, you know, what ifs in history are very hard to answer. I think in my book about the Battle of Britain, With Wings Like Eagles, when I'm considering what would have happened if the Germans had in fact invaded England in May 1940, I use the old English saying, and if my aunt had balls, she'd be my uncle. You know, what would have happened if Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo? We don't know. But this, I think, is true. What Lawrence foresaw was that the Middle East needed a confederation of Arab states, not a single big country, but an alliance, a confederation, something like the United States, in which the independent Arab states would be part of a larger organization that covered the Middle East. There are several things to be said for that. In the first place, it would have shared the oil royalties, which, as matters stand in the Middle East today, as you know, are largely placed in areas that have almost no populations. The countries that have the most advanced political systems and the largest number of inhabitants, Syria, for example, or Egypt, have no oil, or very little. Islands like Abu Dhabi have incalculable amounts of oil. Lawrence's idea was that he knew you could never have a single Arab state because the Arabs are intensely involved in tribe and in clan and in local areas. But he envisioned something like the United States, in which each country would be a state, and it would be at the top of them a disputatious but nevertheless existing central government. Within that area, he saw a Palestine, and actually managed in 1919 to get Emil Faisal and Chaim Weizmann to sign in London Lawrence's draft of what Palestine would be, he thought, in which the Arabs and the Jews would have equal shares of power in Palestine, in which there would be no religious test for any political or other office, and which Faisal, an Arab, foresaw as a place which could accept at least 5 million Jewish immigrants without infringing upon Arab existing land rights, which Lawrence also foresaw. Not surprisingly, that is approximately, or very close to the number of Jews who now live in Israel, but had it been instituted in 1919, it would have enabled a very substantial portion of the European Jews who were murdered by Hitler between 1933 and 1945 to immigrate to Palestine, as opposed to the very few thousands who were able to get there. Lawrence had a very clear, exact vision of how to do that, and he was extraordinarily foresighted.